Hey everybody, Dan from Men Need to Be Heard. Welcome back to the show. Hey, this week we're doing things a little bit differently on the podcast. So normally I have a guest on and we talk about various topics that are important, but today I wanted to share something a little fun with you. Well, maybe not fun, but something that I used to do in the past. So I've talked about before on the podcast how I used to lobby on behalf of fathers. And I was a member of the Fathers and Families of New York. And we were lobbying in New York State to get shared parenting. But also, one of the things we were working on was child support reform. So I did a couple of workshops back in the mid 2000s, 2005, 6, 7, where we brought in legislators. We had some lawyers, judges, that type of thing. And I was kind of doing a workshop to raise awareness of it, to try and make some changes with the laws, right? And I thought it would be fun to kind of share that workshop, or at least the data from it a little bit, and how I was trying to influence it. Ultimately, I'll tell you right up front, we didn't get anything changed, but we did raise some awareness. So in a nutshell, it was positive. We just didn't get as far as we needed to. So I was hoping to share with you the PowerPoint that I created at the time. However, I can't find it. I do have my notes that I used to use to read through the PowerPoint because I was up, in the front of the room doing the PowerPoint, doing the whole talk, surrounded by, I don't know, the first one was probably 25, maybe 30 people were there. Second one was a little bit less. I did it twice. I wish I had that PowerPoint. I can't find it. I do have my notes, and to give you perspective, they're in Office 2007. That's how far back they go. So most of what I'm going to talk about is still germane, though, to today. There have been some changes in the law, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But really, my goal with the whole thing was to kind of, as I said, raise awareness of the realities of child support, because most legislators back then, they'd been hit with the propaganda from the women's groups, and they really didn't have a good understanding of where the law all came from. And that was one of the things that I wanted to work on. So, as I was doing it, I was really trying to educate them. And that's kind of what I want to do with you guys, right? Because there's a lot of misunderstanding when it comes to child support. Now, as I'm going through this, I know I'm going to upset some people because they're going to think I'm being too fair, too neutral, if you will. Keep in mind the audience this was initially created for. It wasn't for fathers trying to understand why child support rates are ridiculous, all right? This was for judges, lawyers, most importantly, legislators, all right? So if I had gone in there with the idea of pounding them over the head about how unfair it is to fathers, most of them would have not shown up, but even if they had, they would have tuned it right out. So bear with me on that. And I understand that, you might not like the way I'm approaching some of this, but that was the audience. And I think that's important for you guys to see and hear, all right? So one of the things that I did initially was to kind of introduce them to what my goal was with the workshop, right? So, it was titled Understanding the Development of Child Support and the Child Support Rates in the United States. That was the initial title for it. And I talked about how I was going to delve into, what it was, what child support actually was, because most people didn't even know that, what its purpose was, which essentially was to ensure that the children were taken care of, all right? And, I came at it from the aspect that child support is part of it, right? The goal is to make sure the children are taken care of. The financial well-being of the children was the actual terminology I used. And yes, child support does play a role in that, but not to the way that it had been legislated. My belief was, and I was saying this to them, that it is important that children receive financial support from both parents, regardless of the relationship status, meaning whether they're married, cohabitating, just mom and dad living in two separate places on their own, not in a relationship, or divorced. In any of those scenarios, it is important that the children are taken care of equally by both parents, in the sense that both households have to take care of the children. Now, some of you might be saying shared parenting, shared parenting. Yes, I get it, right? But that is left out of this for the most part, because that when you're dealing with legislators, you cannot start mixing those things together. That's how you get bills that are 15 feet tall, right? Where you're trying to strip this down a little bit. I did other stuff on shared parenting, and I've talked about the legislative approach to that before. Go check that podcast. I'll put a link in the description on that. But really, this was about child support. And again, we were taking the approach that we understand as fathers, as men, that it is important for both parents to support the children. Because, if we went in there, like I said earlier, and tried to be, oh, it's ridiculous, blah, 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 tune them right out, we would have gotten nowhere. So in the workshop, I told them my aim was to provide them with really an understanding of how the child support rates had been developed in the U.S., talk a little bit about the history, the factors that were included, the methodologies that were used, and how it was both complex and they tried to make it simple, which in the end actually made it more complex. All right, and I also talked about, and this is even more important now, how child support laws changed, how they evolved, how they started reflecting in some ways societal norms, but in others totally ignoring them. Things like economic circumstances came into play, the legalities that are in family law, because it was important that they had a good context of the history behind it so that we could try and move them forward. And I would talk about, and I will talk about with you guys, some of the different historical aspects of it, the things that were used to create the rates as they are. Just to kind of dive into it a little bit, there were really two things that created child support law as it stands right now. So prior to 1975, there really wasn't much, quotes, law on it. There was, but really nothing standardized, right? It was all over the place. Still is, but there was no set thing. So the federal government became aware of this. There were women's groups pushing, no fault divorce was starting to roll through different states. And the women's groups were saying, hey, we're going to divorce the dad, but we want money because we got to take care of the kids. That's what they were doing. All right. So in 1975, an act was done. It's called the Child Support Enforcement and Paternity Establishment Program. Say that 3 times fast. And really, it had really big changes to the child support. In a nutshell, it made the states come up with guidelines. All right. And I'll get into more detail in a little bit. After that, about 20 odd years later, in the mid 1990s, again, there was another push, this time more for welfare reform. But part of that was they were blaming dads for abandoning children, even though it wasn't true. And they wanted to lay the financial burden more on fathers. So as part of an act that was done, which was called the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, again, say that 3 times fast, which passed in 1996, I believe, the laws changed again a little bit. So we're going to delve into that, and we're also going to talk about how the methodologies were created and used to develop the rates, right, the child support rates, and how that's going to be done. And we'll talk a little bit about the different ones. The primary ones were the income model, which I think is the majority of the time that's what's used. There's the income shares model. There's one called the Melson formula. And there's a few others, but those were the main ones. And we're going to talk a little bit about those methodologies. And I think you may say, well, why? Why do I need to know that? You need to know that if you're in a divorce, because that's how your state laws were developed. And if you want to change them down the road, you need to understand why they are the way they are, first of all. And second of all, there's some information in there you might be able to use to help you with your case. All right. Yes, lawyers are supposed to know this stuff, but it's good that you do it. And also talk about some of the strengths and weaknesses of those methodologies and how they claim to be fair, implement fairness, and how they claim to be easy or simple and consistent and all that stuff. We'll talk about, I mean, there were some positives, but there were also, as most of you know, some negatives. But again, just to kind of put a bow on this initial part of it, my viewpoint that I was using, my basis, if you will, for doing this was to ensure that they understood that I was coming from the point of that my goal was the same as theirs, which is making sure the children are taken care of, right? Putting that first and foremost. It doesn't mean we can't criticize. It doesn't mean there aren't challenges that need to be addressed, but coming at it from that perspective, all right? So let's kind of dive into it a little bit. So let's talk about the historical aspects first. And again, I think this is important context for people so that you have an understanding where this all came from. You may think, well, that was 40 years ago. It doesn't matter. It does matter because what happened in 1975 still applies in most cases, most states, here in 2023 as I'm filming this, all right? Yes, things have changed, in some cases significantly. Some of it does reflect societal changes. For example, when the initial act came out in 1975, the paradigm pretty much was dad went off to work, mom stayed at home and took care of the children. Even though feminism had started and women were getting out in the workforce, that was still the dominant paradigm in households, right? Now it's both parents are working all the time. And so some changes came along about that, but really the historical context is crucial to understand because it plays so much of a part of where the rates are now and why things have not changed the way they should have, all right? And that's why I wanted to talk about that. So, as I said earlier, prior to 1975, there wasn't a ton of law out there. What little there was basically was primarily focused on ensuring that fathers fulfilled their financial obligations to children. How do you like how I said that, right? In other words, dad goes off to work, part of his paycheck goes to the children. Has it changed? No, it's pretty much that even now, right? What has changed, though, is prior to 1975, there was almost no enforcement. What little there was very challenging. And the custodial parents, which were almost always the mother, again, something that hasn't changed, really struggled financially. So if we're being fair, there did need to be some change, right? Again, you talk about the pendulum. The pendulum was way over on the side where there was nothing. They went all the way to the other side. And we haven't swung back much. So again, in the early 1970s, there was a lot of change in society. With relation to family law, no-fault divorce was becoming the norm. And so the women's groups were getting quite active and quite vocal and saying, hey, we're going to be filing for divorce. I'm paraphrasing here. We want to make sure the kids are taken care of, so we need to have child support enforcement, et cetera, et cetera. So that started rolling in the early 70s. And like I said, they established that program. It passed, I believe, in 75 and actually became law and started working in 76, right? And the goal behind that was to, one, create specific guidelines. It told the states they had to establish them. This was a federal law, but it basically threw the problem to the states. It also put in things like support enforcement, guidelines on that. How, one of the common things people would do, I say people, but again, back then it was primarily fathers, is if they lived in one state, they'd move to another and there was no cooperation between the states, all right? So that was part of the reason why they were doing what they were doing. I'm not saying right or wrong on that, but I get it. Let's put it that way, all right? And then that even went further in 96, where they really started saying, states, you have to have guidelines, right? You have to have enforcement programs. They were really stressing. Again, the idea was primarily they wanted to get mothers off welfare because there were a lot of mothers on welfare. Guess what? Still are. All right. So they were trying to say that it's all about parental responsibility, and we're going to make the non-custodial parents pay. That was what it's known as the PRWORA Act, the 96 one. So it even took it further, requiring the states to really get their guidelines in place to calculate child support obligations, make sure it was consistent between the states, trying to get it narrowed down a little bit, and fair, their version of fair. And again, it was the federal government providing the guidelines, but telling the states general guidelines, but telling the states, you need to get the specifics. All right. The federal government gave them parameters. They gave the states some flexibility within them. But that's why you see different states at different rates and all that stuff, right? And again, the mindset at the time was primarily we're going to make sure the mom gets as much money. Has that changed? No, not at all. There has been some change. There's a movement going on that recognizes that both parents should be involved in the children's lives, and child support needs to be part of it, but it needs to change a little bit. That is starting to happen, but as I always say, it's like a turtle trying to walk through a ton of peanut butter, dragging a 50-pound anchor behind them, right? But really their goal was to, in that act, make sure that both parents took on financial responsibility. So again, it created this hybrid of guidelines throughout the states. I don't think any one state is the same as another. There's differences between all of them. And really, there were two models that were used primarily to create the child support laws. One was the percentage of income model, and the other was the income shares model. In a nutshell, the percentage of income basically takes the non-custodial parent's income, applies a percentage to it, and that's what it is. New York State, it was 17% for one child, 24 for two, 29 for three, 31 for four, and it went up a couple after that. That's what New York State still uses to this day primarily. If you're going to get divorced in New York State, they're going to take that non-custodial parent's income. There's a few deductions. Taxes aren't one of them, by the way. It's gross income. And they apply the percentage. That's how they come up with it. And that's what a lot of states do. The income shares model, which New York has moved a little bit to, basically takes both income and then kind of decides what child support based on proportionate share depending on the incomes. Little bit fairer, in my opinion, but still not perfect. So we'll get into that a little bit more, but that's basically the historical background on it, if you will. So let's dive into those models, those methodologies for calculating child support a little bit further. And again, I could spend 3 hours on each model. I really could. So I'm gonna keep this as short and sweet as I can because it's important for understanding. All right. So every state is different. They use different methodologies, as I said. The primary two were the percentage of income model and the income shares model. So let's talk about percentage of income model. I have my bullet points in front of me, so bear with me here. So that model is probably the most commonly used one for calculating child support, right? It's as I said before, it's basically takes the non-custodial's parent income and puts a flat fixed percentage applied against it. Like I said, New York was 17%. And it goes up based on the number of children. So, one state might say it's 20 for one, 25 for two, 30 for three. Another, New York was 17, 24, 29. North Carolina, back in the time, I don't know the exact number, but I believe they were somewhere in there. Every state was different, right? The advantages to it that they used to claim was, it made things very simple, right? And relatively speaking, it is. and I'm going to use 100,000 as my baseline because I like easy math. If you had 2 children in New York and you made 100,000, your child support payments were going to be $25,000 a year over the, spread out over the year. They didn't care about you had to pay taxes. They didn't factor in things like, well, you have the children too sometimes. It was just, dad's going to take $25,000 and hand it to mom. Done. Couldn't be any simpler. Couldn't be any more wrong either. Their other argument they were making at the time was that it was the easiest way to, or the way to make it easier for the non-custodial parent to pay, meaning it was directly tied to their income. It just basically said it takes their income, applies a percentage, which means it takes into account their ability to support the children. Problems with that? Well, what happens if dad loses his job? And case law became, too bad, so sad, dad, you still going to pay. Still is in most cases. But really, that was their argument back then. And, some of the other things that they were using with that was that it was consistent, right? And even though the states had different percentages, it was very easy to understand for the general public, all right? The problem with it was, as I kind of mentioned, is it's very imprecise. It does not take into account the actual cost of taking care of a child, right? It just says, here's the income, here's a percentage, done. So in most cases, that never works out, right? It's not exactly, if we're using $100,000, it's not exactly $25,000 to raise 2 children. Doesn't take into account, as I said, custody arrangements. What if dad's got the children 49% of the time and mom's got them 51%? Shouldn't that be taken into account? Nope. Under the percentage of income, that's not accounted for at all. Healthcare expenses. What if the child was sick and had additional ones? Under the income percentage model, that wasn't accounted for. Case law later changed that, but it really was. Or child-related costs that are extraordinary and above or reduced, right? What if those 2 children, one is 16 and the other's 8? Well, the 16-year-old could watch the child after school potentially. Wasn't factored in. The other way around, what if they were both young and you had childcare? Again, a lot of those things were not, it didn't account for real life, as I like to say. Case law later kind of worked on that to fix it, but that's what it was. The other model was the income shares model. Now that was used by quite a few states. And really what it did was it combined, and this is where most states I think are at now. I don't study every state. Lawyers could tell you better than I, but basically it combined both parents' incomes, right? The initial one was more about the assumption that mom was a stay-at-home, dad was out earning the money, take a percentage of his income and give it to mom. Things started morphing. The income shares model became more prevalent. Takes in the income, because moms were working too, of both parents, and then applies a proportionate share based on that income. So, for example, let's say dad made $100,000, mom made $50,000. Well, combined they make $150,000. If you take the percentages, 2/3 of the child's support comes from dad, 1/3 from mom. That's how it works. And again, it's a straight income-based calculation. It does take into account both parents' incomes, which in theory makes things fairer. I can't quibble with that. I understand that. That's a valid thing. And it does really take out that paradigm a little bit of mom was the stay-at-home, so dad's going to pay all the support, if we're being fair. So, again, it kind of moved things towards it's more both parents' financial responsibility for the children. The problem was, and you're probably going to laugh when I say this, but I remember standing in front of them and a couple of them going, well, that's really complicated. And I would sit there and go, what? I mean, well, we should stick with this, a flat percentage. This is legislators talking to me. And I'm like, what is complicated about the income shares model? Dad makes X, mom makes Y. You add X and Y. That's the total income. You figure out the percentages. This isn't advanced calculus, my friend. He never got it. I'm not going to say anything more than that. But they was issues with that. Like, well, this is much harder than the other way. But it gives you a thought to how their mind was working on this. Then the other side of it that they were often bringing up with that, and this was a fair point, was there were issues like income reporting or people hiding money. Both sides, by the way, to be fair to them. Well, what if mom's working and not reporting it, or working under the table? What if she's babysitting, one of them said, and she's getting paid cash? I gave them credit for bringing that up. And then, of course, they had to bring up all the things dads might do. The other side of it, too, and I kind of talked about this, was, what happens if dad loses his job? Well, they would impute income to him. He was making $100,000. He lost his job. The company closed. He's not making that anymore, but he got another job, but he's making $60,000, but we're still going to calculate it based on that $100,000 because, he should still be able to make that. So things like that. And there were other issues that came along that led to disputes. The general thinking behind it was that the income shares model, as I said, in their mind was tougher than the straight income shares, right? But again, it was starting to get some awareness out there. And again, as I said, every state was approaching this differently. Some adopted the percentage of income exclusively. Others went with the income shares exclusively. A lot of states, most states, I think, I don't know this for a fact, but I'm making a pretty good guess. Most states incorporated elements of both, creating, I'll call it a hybrid approach. And that's why you see the rates different all over the place from the different states. And they would argue that they were trying to be fair and consistent. Every state has unique things, and that's a fair point. But it also created chaos too. Well, what if mom's living in one state, dad's in another? Which state's rules apply? It's where the children live primarily. But I've also seen where, well, it's whatever state's going to benefit mom to get the most money too. And again, the states are still, to this day, required to periodically update and review their guidelines, and are supposed to take into things changes that are occurring, changes in societal, mom's working, things like, well, the cost of living has increased. They were supposed to incorporate things like feedback from parents, attorneys, judges, advocacy groups, that type of thing. Periodically, they hold hearings. I used to go to those hearings, and I would present stuff like I'm doing right now, and talk about this stuff. That's why I talk about why the historical is so important, why the methodology talk is so important, because this is what legislators, judges, the whole family court, family law system operates under. So not knowing the stuff that I'm talking about or saying, oh, that's not important, it is highly important, because this is what they use to determine things. This is how the law becomes the law, all right? So by understanding that, these methodologies they use and the historical about it, it can help you to kind of try and enforce change. All right. So again, I'm taking and shrinking this down a little bit. It was much more complicated. I used to show in that PowerPoint, I had graphs on different things. You guys don't need to worry about that. But it helps to kind of give you a flavor for what I was talking about. So next I want to talk about how they let factors influence the rates that child support were set at. So as I said, the primary one that drives it back then, right through till now, is income, right? Originally, it was primarily the income of dad. And to be fair, back in the 70s, dads were the one bringing in the income, all right? But now it's based more on the income of both parents. There is a recognition that both parents do indeed work. So when they're trying to set the rates, I'm not talking the specific rate, but in general, they want it to be that the income of both the custodial and non-custodial parent is a factor in determining the child support rates, right? The amount of money. They wanted to take into account things like the financial resources available to both parents and use that as a factor to determine the amount of money to be paid or not paid. So one of the things they did was one of the things you'll hear them talk about was what is the role that we need to attribute to both parents to take into account their ability to contribute to the child's well-being, the finances available for the child's well-being. So things like their salaries, their wage. What if they're self-employed? That was a factor that was commonly talked about. Things like bonuses, right? What if mom or dad gets a huge bonus at the end of the year? Things like income from dividends from stocks and all that kind of stuff. All the other sources of revenue. They want to make sure that all of that gets put into child support calculations. And again, they were trying to simplify things, but they actually made it much more complicated doing that. One perfect example. If you're self-employed, I'm self-employed. My income could go up or down drastically year to year. Perfect example, right? My income in 2019 was one thing. Self-employed business owner of a gym. Guess what happened in 2020? The gyms got closed for months. My income plummeted. Now, if I were still paying child support, I'd have been screwed because the courts would never have accounted for that. They would have said, too bad, so sad. We're going to use 2019's income. That's the problem, right? So they were trying to simplify, but they made it much more complicated. And the courts were closed. You weren't getting in to get a modification done. I will tell you right now, you don't hear about it. That had a significant factor on why child support arrears has skyrocketed, all right? Some other things that they started to kind of think about a little bit was the custody arrangements. Now, you'll often hear the argument made that dad wants the kids more because he doesn't want to pay child support. You hear it all the time, right? From the women's groups. The part they leave out is mom wants to maximize the time she's got because then she gets more money, right? So their own argument works against them when you really throw it back at them. But the reason all of that came around was they started taking into account the custody arrangements, how much time each child spends with the parent, and then using that to impact the calculations. So if it was let's say a shared custody or a joint custody arrangement where both parents had, we'll call it substantial parenting time, they started to take that into account and adjust the expenses, sharing them to a certain extent. They didn't go far enough with that. The perfect example I use is rent or mortgage, but I'm going to call it rent. They still make the assumption with the custodial parent in many cases that the full amount of rent should be taken into account in calculating child support. So, where I live, a one-bedroom apartment would run you, I'm going to round it to roughly $1,400. We'll use $1,400. A two-bedroom might run you $1,600, $1,700. So if you have a kid, you need a two-bedroom. The difference would be mom living alone would be paying $1,400. With a kid, let's use $1,700, right? The difference is $300. That's the number that should be used in the child support calculation, $300, right? Because mom still would have had to pay the $1,400 if she was living on her own. They don't. They use the $1,700 in many cases. Not all, many. All right. There's no hard and fast here. Every state's different. That's just one example. Utilities, same thing. They take the full amount of the utilities instead of, the kid might create $10 more in a month. So that's one problem that created it. And again, that all goes into the custody because that they only calculated on the mom's side. They weren't calculating on the dad. So they wanted to kind of fix that a little bit and start taking that into effect. These were all things that were proposed 20, 25, 30 years ago. That's why I'm talking about it. They're still out there. It didn't change, right? We're still having these same arguments now. I want you to keep in context where this original workshop came from. Mid 2000s, 2004, 5, 6, 7, trying to change the child support laws to reflect what was going on, right? What had been created from the law changes in 75 and 96. This is where this whole thing was coming from. And that's why I'm talking the way I am. I know some of you are going, what are you talking about? This was directed at the judges, the lawyers. I want you to remember that. And most importantly, the legislators, all right? So one of the other things we started talking about within the workshop was the child's needs. So this was a big thing back then. Well, you know, in New York especially, well, we're only doing percentage of income. We're not calculating, you know, what the child's needs are, which was a nebulous term they would use. But really what they were talking about is things like education, health care if the child was sick often, that type of thing. Things like extracurricular activities. That was the famous phrase they used. You know, kids playing sports because Johnny's in Little League. Well, dad should be paying part of that. Special circumstances, because there are situations out there. They wanted to make sure that was being taken into account more and more because the judges were saying, look, the law says flat percentage of income or percentage of income share. We're not factoring that in, and they were trying to get stuff in that. So some states started incorporating those expenses into the calculation. Other things they were kind of factoring in were things like medical insurance premiums or child care costs. Those were two biggies back then, still are now, right? They wanted to make sure that those were covered for the children, and it created issues. Perfect example is education. So again, I'll use the state of New York because I was in family court all the time there. Child support does not end at 18 like most people think. It's 21 if the child's in college, right? Or until the child graduates. Here's the thing in New York State that they created with this simple model that they were trying to create. If you are a married couple and your child turns 18, you can say, see ya, we're done supporting you. We're not paying for college. Perfectly legal, fine. You know, I'm not getting into the morality of it. I'm just saying, kick Johnny out the door, kick Jane out the door, and we ain't paying a dime for your college. A married couple can do that. Divorced couple, you're going to pay support. You're going to pay for a portion of the child's college. You can be required to do that. It creates this paradigm where if you're married, you don't have to pay for college education. If you're divorced, you're pretty much guaranteed you're going to pay for it in some form. That's what they created with this, right? With that whole child's needs thing. And we were raising awareness on that. Why is that the way it is? Why is it two different ways depending on if you're married or divorced? Shouldn't it be the same for both? You should have seen their faces. Because I'm giving you the highlights, but that particular one, we went probably 20 minutes just on what I just talked about. Because they were not happy with me when I brought that example up. Well, what do you mean? It's fair. How is that fair? If I'm married and say I'm not paying for my child's education, they want to get an education, they want to go to college, they can pay for it themselves. That's perfectly fine. The other way around, no. And then they got into the whole, well, you got to fill out the form. What is it, the FAFSA form or whatever? It's all BS, all right? Another factor that came into play, and we were talking about a lot in the workshop, was the standard of living. So there's this nebulous term out there that the child should continue to have the same standard of living they had when the parents were together. All right. Now, trying to take $100,000 of income for one house and then use that same $100,000 of income for two houses ain't gonna work. No way, no how to have the same standard of living, right? If both parents have to have a place to live that can also handle the children, you have to take into account there's going to be less money available for both houses as opposed to just trying to fund one, if you catch what I'm talking about. But they wanted this, we're going to make sure the child has the same standard of living. So we're going to take that into consideration on the child support laws and the rate calculations. The problem became, though, they only focused on the primary residence. So you'll hear the thing, custodial parent, non-custodial parent. Primary residence, visitation residence. And they all became, well, the child spends most of their time with mom, so we're going to make sure the money goes there. Dad would be living in this shithole apartment and feeding the kids ramen noodles because he was paying for what they were like at mom's house. Then that was used to limit his time to see the children. Well, the children are a great standard of living here. His standard's not so good, so we're going to just give him every other weekend because we don't want the children in that. Saw it happen. It became the reality. But that's one of the things they were trying to incorporate. So again, I would talk to them about that. And then there were other things like they called them deviations from the guidelines, right? So what that meant was it gave the judges flexibility to not follow the guidelines, which they rarely, if ever, did. But it was there, and again, it was allow them to impute income was a common one specifically. I remember this is many years ago, there was a professional basketball player who was making a lot of money. I forget which one it was. Well, he ended up getting cut. So his income plummeted. They still expected him to pay like he was still making that, he was making millions a years, and they calculated his child support based on that. As all professional athletes do, they eventually get cut, retire, whatever. They were still expecting him to pay the child support as if he was still playing. Not going to happen, not realistic. But they called that, it's within the guidelines. And the argument against it was we need to make a deviation there. So, other things that came into play were extraordinary medical expenses, as I've talked about before. The child gets sick, God forbid, has cancer or something like that. The education costs, as I talked about, right? That's how they started lumping in things like college education, books. They were finding everything they could. Anything to maximize the amount of child support. And there were other obligations, right? But in theory, the requirement was the judge had to put it in writing why, the justification. And then again, make a ruling on it. So, these were all things that were supposed to happen and that they were talking about back then. Guess what? They're still talking about it now. Still to this day. 25 years later, 20 years later, they're still talking about it. It just shows you what a clusterfuck that child support is. Sorry to swear, but it is. And again, every state read into it differently. That's why it's all over the place. And you'll see there are states that have very strict, detailed formulas that you follow. You fill out forms and blah, blah, blah. There are others that it's just flat, whatever the percentage is. There are others that are somewhere in between. Some consider some things. Some don't consider those same things. It is insane. But in theory, this was all to create consistency and fairness. And they, like I said, they were trying to simplify it, and they made it far more complicated. Kind of like they do with the tax code, right? If we could have a flat tax, just not the side note, but we could have a flat tax and say everybody's going to pay X percentage of their income flat, be done with it. Instead, we have a tax code that wouldn't fit in this room I'm sitting in, right? When you let the government try and fix things and make it simpler, they inevitably make it much harder. But it kind of gave guidelines. That was what their whole thing was. We're going to be consistent. We're going to be fair. We're going to make it as simple as possible. And then the courts and the people can calculate what the child support obligation is. But as I said, they made what is supposed to be a thing that takes into account all these factors, and it is complex if I'm being fair. They tried to simplify it and they made it more complex. But in reality, it is a complex process. It's a struggle to find the right balance between the parents, the households, making sure the children are taken care of so that you don't create a household where, it's Disneyland and then the other household is, whatever you want to call it, poorhouse, right? And you'll often hear the women's group say, well, yeah, dad's house is Disneyland and we're living in squalor. More often than not, it's the other way around. But they were hoping that by taking into account all the various factors, the income, the custody arrangements, the child's needs, the standard of living, all of that, they were trying to be fair and equitable. And in reality, they weren't. And that's kind of where I want to go now is to talk about some of the criticisms and challenges. So, when we're talking about this, again, we're coming from the mindset that our ultimate goal is making sure the children are taken care of. And again, we're talking financially here. We're not talking about day-to-day care, making sure Johnny gets up and goes to school and all that. We're talking financially. So it is fair to say that in many cases, not all, child support's going to play a role, potentially a crucial role, right? But it created these challenges, and there were legitimate criticisms because of that. So I want to talk a little bit about that. And again, coming from the aspect of when I presented this workshop, it was to judges, lawyers, and primarily legislators, right? Trying to get them to understand. And this was the meat of that workshop. So everything I was talking about before was to lay the groundwork for where I'm going. So hopefully you've stuck in this time, because I know for many people, I've put them to sleep there. But this is important information that you need to have to understand why we're at where we're at in 2023 and why things really haven't changed in 2 decades, 3 decades, 4 decades. All right. So probably the biggest criticism back then, and guess what? Still to this day, is that perceived bias, that there is a built-in bias within the child support system. One that I think is universally acknowledged, that the system disproportionately favors the custodial parent, mom primarily. And it creates tremendous inequities in the support orders. Some of the things I've already talked about. What if dad loses his job? How do you cover 2 houses with 1 income and expect it to be the same as if it was 1? Things like that. Add to it, on top of it is, when you put these cut and dried laws in, if you're using the income model where it's, X percentage of dad's income and you're not factoring anything else in, like, I don't know, the fact that he's got to pay federal, state income tax, those aren't factored in most of the time. It creates this really difficult situation for the non-custodial parent, aka dad, right? Because majority, 90-something percentages of the time, and this was something I brought up, that they hated me for this. Oh, I threw this one in their face so much. Let me just sidetrack to that. So at the time in New York, we figured it out, right? Mom got primary custody 93% of the time. Dad got primary custody 7%. Now, you'll hear, well, that's not true because dads get custody, blah, blah, blah percent. That's joint custody. Primary custody is different than joint custody. Primary custody is when the kids are with mom. A mom is the primary custodian. Means that she's getting the child support, all right? Once you're named primary, you're the one getting the support. Non-custodial parent, visitations and all that stuff, they're the one that's going to pay. So there was this bias that was created. And basically it was, mom's going to get the kids, dad's going to pay child support. That bias still exists to this day. If you look at the data, that's the way it falls to this day. I don't know the exact numbers now, but that 93% we found back in 2004 and 5, I'm sure still applies, or close to it. I'm sure it's dropped a little bit because dads are getting primary custody more often, to be fair, but it's probably at least 80-85% going to the moms. And again, it creates this bias when it comes to child support. The other issue that comes into play is enforcement. So that's where the whole deadbeat dad thing came out of in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, right? Dads are not covering the costs of their children. They're not supporting their children. They're disappearing. It was all a lie, by the way. Majority of the time, dads were still around, still paying and helping to take care of the kids. But especially in the 90s with that Welfare Reform Act, they created this monster they called the deadbeat dad. It was all over the place, right? For those of you not old enough or to have been around then. There was PSAs everywhere. It was in the news constantly. Dads are awful. It's why we're this perception of what dads are now. You got Hollywood saying dads are bumbling idiots and not paying for their children, don't take care of them. You hear mothers groups talk about it to this day. What you hear those mother groups, that's what the government and all these other things were saying back then and still are now. So it created this myth that we needed to really drastically change enforcement, right? And let's be honest, there were some challenges. There are guys that skip town. There are non-custodial parents. They always like to say it's non-custodial parents. It's not dads. Well, when 93% of the custody is going to mom, it's fair to say it's dads. So there are dads who fail to meet their financial obligation. There are guys who try and skip out. Let's be honest, they are. They're few and far between. In fact, when you look at it, when moms are the ones supposed to be paying child support, they fail to meet their obligations and pay far more than dads do. But that's what happens, right? So they created all these laws. Dad's going to lose his driver's license. Dad's going to potentially go to jail. Now, I remember sitting in the workshop and they'd be going, yeah, that's right. He should lose his driver's license. And I would say to them, okay, dad's struggling. He loses his job for whatever reason. The company closes. He can't afford to pay. He's trying to get a modification, but that takes time. By the way, modifications aren't retroactive. So until he gets that modification, if you're telling him he's got to pay $1,000 a week in support and he's making $200 on, whatever program he's on, how do you expect him to do it? Well, he's got to come up with the money. Well, where's he going to get it from? Well, I don't know. That's his problem. And until he does, we're going to take away his driver's license. So, okay, now he can't drive to his new job that he's trying to get. How does that help? Well, it was amazing watching them. Their heads would almost explode when I would throw this crap at them, right? The realities, as I call it. There's the law, and then there's the reality of the world. But that was a common. We're going to take away his driver's license. We're going to take away his ability to work because we're going to put him in jail. Okay, debtor's prison. Well, it's not debtor's prison. Yes, it is. You're expecting him to be able to pay his child support, but you're going to have him in jail so he can't work. How's that going to work? Well, he'll have to get the money from somewhere else. See, their expectation was, and I'll tell you, one of them flat out said it, well, his family can come up with the money. That's what they should do. That's what this guy actually believed. Okay, you're going to hold him hostage in prison until his mother and father or his brother and sister or whomever comes up with the money. Really? Yep. This guy was steadfast with that. Again, dad did nothing wrong. He just happened to lose his job for whatever reason. And, couldn't pay. But that's when they started. This was trying to raise awareness about the fallacy of these enforcements that they were putting into place. And I would throw in, it's not part of this conversation, but I would throw in subtly here because, again, we were focused on child support. But I would say, again, you're not taking into account when mom refuses to let dad see the children. And that creates that bias I just talked about. I said, and I would say to them, I'm not trying to change the subject here, but you want to talk about bias, there you go, right? Why is there enforcement on child support and no enforcement whatsoever with visitation? And I would just leave it at that. Get their heads spinning a little bit, right? But that was a legitimate issue, and they would, we would have a discussion on it. So each one of these was a little point of discussion generally. Because my workshop that I did was more of a give and take type one. And again, I'm trying to take what was an entire afternoon and keep this somewhat short. And again, so another factor that came into play was, trying to figure out what is income and how is it coming into the house. And, and they would bring up things like self-employment I mentioned earlier, or the one I would often throw at them, because it was very common for moms to make money being babysitters or taking care of other people's children. And that was almost always cash-based, right? But that was, if you're in an income shares model, that was never factored in. If you're a non-custodial parent doing a cash-based business. It's not as common now, obviously, as it was back then, because Venmo and all that didn't exist back then. Um, those were factors that they would bring up and I would bring up. See, I love to turn their arguments back on them, and they hated me for that. But it got them thinking, right? I was very polite with it and all that. But the reality is, if you're going strictly on an income shares model or an income percentage model, people are going to tend to try and underreport their income, especially on an income shares model. So, it created this issue that trying to figure out exactly how much money there was, and how to then assess that so that each parent is contributing the right amount, it created these huge issues. And it led to a lot of legislation, first of all, but also, court dates. They'd be constantly going into court. And who was making the money there? The Bar Association, the lawyers. They would say, well, and I've seen lawyers do this. Well, his business, he's probably bringing in some cash that he's not reporting. So, tell you what we're going to do. We're going to file a motion. We're going to subpoena all the documents and all that. Mom would be, yeah. We're going to get him. We're going to get him. Well, who was making the money? Because to file that motion, to subpoena all those docs, to read the docs, to see if there's anything going on, you're paying out ungodly amounts of money to that attorney, right? Back then, an attorney was making $200-300 an hour. It's more than that now. Attorneys reading a document, you're paying for that time, right? It was all part of the issue that I was trying to raise, which is we're not simplifying, we're complicating things, right? That was my whole thing behind this, subtly. So that was another factor. Another factor I would talk about was the changing in family dynamics at the time. So again, when the laws originally were written in the early mid-70s, it was dad's the breadwinner, mom stays at home. In the 90s, it was starting to change. Women were in the workforce. In the early 2000s, up till now, obviously women pretty much on equal amounts to men. But they weren't taking that into account so much in the child support, right? It created issues that they didn't like, they being the judges and the lawyers, because they had to account for that. And the law really didn't help them. So things like changes in custody agreements too. It was, went from de facto mom's going to get full custody, dad's going to be a visitor, to joint custody became more prevalent, shared custody, and so on. And they had to factor all that stuff in, and it created issues and made it more complex. And they didn't really change the laws that much with it. So when you were looking at the income shares and all that, it didn't account for that. So we would raise that. And then there were other economics things that we would kind of throw at them, which is, these calculations, these percentages you're using, they are just cut and dried. If dad makes 100,000 and he's got two kids, he's going to pay 25,000. It doesn't take things like cost of living increases. As I talked about many times, wage levels change, right? Economic conditions. Hello, we just came out of a pandemic. You think any of that was reflected in any of the child support rates? Not a chance. Not a chance. I don't know. I'm not aware of a single state that made a change. There may be one out there. If there are, comment below, let me know. And they would argue, by the way, it was the other way. Well, dads were probably making more money. Were they? They put into place these periodic reviews every 4 years, but it needs to be more often than that because things change rapidly, right? If you did a review in 2019 and the pandemic hit in 2020, and you're now reviewing in 2023, you just had that 4 years of, you all know what we went through. That was never reflected in the family law, right? So again, these were all criticisms that I was bringing up and trying to raise awareness on, and the challenges within them, and why we needed to reform things. And really, the reforms that I was talking about were improving the focus on things like fairness, fairness in assessing how much it would be, or if there should even be that. If both parents have children equally and their incomes are fairly the same, Why is there any child support? There shouldn't be, right? Um, the accuracy of it, making sure we have the right numbers, so to speak. And then enforceability fairness. Throwing dad in jail because he can't pay is not going to help anyone. The children are going to end up worse off. But then in their mind, they're all the children, he'll pay. Well, again, there are a lot of guys that spent a lot of time in jail and came, because eventually what would happen is the states or the counties and all that would be like, we're keeping this guy in jail. It's costing us thousands of dollars to keep him in jail, and nothing's changing. Duh, right? So again, all of these things were coming into play, and we were trying to get them to understand that. And we were trying to talk about how we could make better solutions. So, again, technology was part of the plan there, right? Is look, and I still advocate for this. If you're a non-custodial parent, dad, and you have to pay child support, I 100% believe you should be paying the state and let the state disperse it to mom, because it creates proof. Because moms will lie. Sorry, ladies, but you lie through your teeth all the time. If the dad writes a check to mom and there's nothing there, doesn't matter. That doesn't count as you paid your child support. Well, he gave me that for X. He told me go ahead and buy it, and that's why that's how they get around counting that as child support, right? Or if God forbid you handed her cash. I saw so many guys were like, "Yep, I gave her cash every week." That's useless, guy. You're going to get back assessed to pay that. Well, I already gave it to her. No, you didn't. Not according to the law. So we were saying use technology. So that's what they started creating, the child support enforcement agencies. Dads would, automatic deduction from their paycheck goes to the state. Do it. I highly, if you have to pay child support, do that, because it creates that record. And then the beauty of it is, because the states are forever late dispersing the money back to mom, she goes to court. Happens all the time. I've seen it. He isn't paying his child support. Your Honor, here's my pay stub. They take it out. It goes to the state. I can't control what the state does with it after that. Happened to me. It's happened to, I don't know how many guys I know. It's a beautiful thing. And the judge goes, he paid. You're out. Sorry. Go contact the state. That's their problem. It's a beautiful thing when that happens. Fun little victory. Minor one, but a victory, right? But using technology to kind of really streamline the process, reduce that ability to, enforce against the dad, because if he's paying the state, he's free and clear at that point, right? But things like that. And then we were also talking about, well, the laws need to change to account for things like, dad loses his job. It can take weeks, if not months, to get a modification through. The modifications are not retroactive usually. That needs to be taken into account. We need changes on that. We need to stop imputing income all the time, right? Or put into it, there has to be proof of that. So saying, dad loses his job and the only thing he can find is a job paying a fraction of what it was, reassess the support at that level, and then, help him, provide resources to him to get a job at what he was making, because a lot of times that's just the reality, right? Things like that. And also, oh, by the way, do the same for mom. If mom's only making, if dad's making 100,000, mom's making 30, instead of leaving it like that, provide resources so that mom can raise her income. Doesn't that benefit the children? Oh, they didn't like that one. Oh man, they did not like that one. Really kind of upset them. Well, she's got to take care of the children. No, dad can take care of the children. Again, the idea behind this workshop is to get their mind going, get them thinking, get them out of that box they're in. And then other things we were talking about were mediation over going to court, right? Using mediation, making it affordable, and finding other ways to avoid going to court, because the lawyers were making the money. Again, we were trying to make changes to that within this workshop, get that mindset changed, and really make it so support was for the children, because it's not for the children. When you do a straight income share, there's no accountability. That was the other thing. I'm going to kind of touch on that now. I was going to talk about it later, but let's touch on it now, which is there's no accountability for how that money's spent. So you hear all the time, guys say, well, she goes and gets her nails done. That may be true, may not be true, right? There's no accountability. No one knows because there's nothing tracking it. So we were advocating for that also within the workshop, so that we recognize that child support is supposed to be for the children, not for the parent, and it should be fair for both. Both parents should be responsible. But trying to get them to understand that when they're making these policies and these laws, that it was fair for all and ensured that the child was taken care of. I kind of touched on this a little bit, so I want to go to the next part here. I talked about it before. They don't take into consideration the expenses for dad, the non-custodial parent. So most of the time, when they were doing all these calculations and trying to figure out the percentage, they didn't take into account at all, in many cases, that dad needs a roof over his head. The kids have to have a place to sleep when they're with dad. Oh, by the way, they got to eat when they're with dad. So it was legitimate criticism to say that nothing they were doing accounted for that. Or if it did, it didn't account for it at any level that was reality. It was very, very small, right? To factor things in like, he's got to pay extra to have a 2-bedroom house or apartment versus a 1 or a 3-bedroom or whatever. Or he's got to feed the children or all of that stuff. So I would kind of delve into that a little bit. So again, I kind of touched on it a little bit already, but non-custodial parents, dads, have their own obligations, right? And expenses that are for the children, but are never taken into account in the calculations. So we were arguing about that. Housing was a big one. Utilities, right? What about him having to go pick the children up? If he's 3 hours away, mom moves, to the other side of the state, and he's got to pay all that gas. That's not calculated. It's not. It should be, right? Could be things like medical bills or stuff like that. And the big one was taxes. I kept hammering on that. You don't account for federal and state income tax. Why? Is that realistic? Because mom gets that money tax-free. So if dad makes $100,000 and she's getting $25,000, she does not report that $25,000. Dad's got to pay the taxes on it. So that $25,000 in New York, by the time you get paid all your taxes, about 30%. Well, now that $25,000 has become 83 or 33. Sorry, you get my point. And oh, by the way, when you start factoring in other things, that's why dads are struggling all the time with that. It doesn't take into account taxes at all in many states. Some states it does. So failing to consider these puts an undue burden on the non-custodial parent and hinders their ability to take care of the children properly, which is then weaponized against them to reduce the amount of time they have. Well, he isn't feeding the kids right. He's feeding them ramen noodles. I'm giving them, coq au vin. It was weaponized. Don't think it wasn't planned that way too. So again, we were trying to get them to see that. And we were also trying to say, we understand why you want to standardize the guidelines to make it, quotes, easier. And it does kind of create uniformity, makes it, predictable, if you will. If you're going to divorce, you kind of know you're going to get this. But it doesn't account for the specific financial circumstances of both parties. And as I said, the expenses of the non-custodial parent. And we wanted them to start taking that into account. To this day, most states, they still don't do that, right? Again, we're trying to talk about change now. This is where we were trying to do the framework of it. And our argument was, look, we need to change the paradigm from these flat percentages that you were using to what is the actual cost to raise the child, and get into things like, all right, both parents have to have, let's say there's 2 children. Well, in theory, you need a 3-bedroom house or apartment. Both parents need to have that. Instead of basing it on mom's entire amount is calculated, dad's is 0, let's calculate both. And oh, by the way, they both still got to live. So let's take that out of the equation. Things like that. Much more complicated, if we're being honest, but much more fair. So we wanted them to start accounting for variances in individual circumstances, take into account other things. What if dad's got medical issues and huge medical bills? The way that a child support model is now, not factored in at all. Let's say dad gets cancer, can't work, has to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in treatment potentially. None of that is accounted for. Does it happen all the time? No. But does it happen? You better believe it does. That guy is screwed. And I know of cases like that. I talk to guys like that, all right? Every family's situation is unique, and it needs to be treated that way. And things like medical conditions, potentially high debt out of the marriage, especially these days, other things that may come in, but they should all be factored in. Taxes is, again, I can keep hammering it because that's the big one. The argument I would make is that by simplifying things and not allowing for flexibility, you've made it much more difficult. They should be flexible. They should be unique to each family's circumstances and really provide a better representation of what both parents should pay. What if mom gets cancer? Dad's now got to take care of the kids. Shouldn't child support reflect that? No, it doesn't. It's flat, right? So again, it's more complicated, yet in my mind, it's not as complicated as what they have now. The other thing I would throw out there too is, legal things. So, they create these laws, they make things very strict in the sense they want to simplify, it's very strict, but they take away that flexibility. So that's how judges get their hands tied. They always talk about we don't want to tie the judge's hands, but that's exactly what they're doing. They're tying the judge's hands because they don't allow him to go, geez, dad's got cancer. He's got hundreds of thousands of dollars of bills. He can't work. We got to account for that. Nope. 17%, 24%, 21%, whatever the state says. Doesn't account for that stuff. It's ridiculous. So, that's why that stuff needs to be addressed in calculating it. And finding that balance between, what the child needs, but the ability of both parents to pay. And that's why those income models, I think, need to go. So I'm starting to morph into the changes here that you probably wanted me to do way at the beginning. But again, that historical context is important and things to think about. So, if you're trying to bring about change, this is the area now where let's just talk about that briefly, okay? Because again, I've kind of laid the framework. Now we were having the discussion. So that was about the first 2 hours of my presentation. A little discussion here, but now we were addressing these things. Let's get into conversations. Let's talk about whatever it is. And like I said, I did it twice primarily. I offered this to some other things like dad's groups. I would talk about this, but with the legislators, I did 2 sessions and the judges and so forth. And that's when these discussions were happening. And some of the stories I've talked about, that's where they came in from. But trying to make sure that, one, I'm coming from the perspective of the child's needs are the most important, but child's needs should be the basics: shelter, food, medical care. That's what a married couple is required to give. Why is it different for a divorced couple? Why is it that a married couple can say, yeah, I'm not going to send Johnny to Little League or pay for that? Why is it that a married couple can say, I'm not paying for college, but a divorced couple's forced to? Is that fair? Is that right? Why is that inequity? And we would have discussions on that. Again, talking about things like, what if dad or mom loses the job? Where's the flexibility there? And the realism, if you will, of that, because it happens all the time, right? What if something like a pandemic comes along? Where's the law that's supposed to be flexible and fair and all that? Where does it account for things like that? we need to look for alternative approaches that really take into account the entire family's unique situation. Again, I'm not talking about custody primarily on that. I touch on it here and there, but they're two separate issues, but yet they're also intertwined, right? So we all know the big factor that most men push for is they want more time with their kids. Set that aside from child support. They try and bring it together, and yes, that is a part of it. But the reality is, dads aren't. This myth that dads only want more time with the kids to not pay child support is that it's a myth. It's a lie. It's a flat out lie. Dads want to be involved in their kids, and that needs to be reflected, right? But it's not, and yet it also is. See what I'm saying, right? They've made it so convoluted and complicated because of things like that. So we need to change the approach. My feeling is that the best approach that I've come up with is putting into place where you take the family's finances. Again, I'm using a divorced couple that was married as the primary, fully understanding there's couples that have children that don't live together and never have, right? The oops babies, if you will. Different scenario, but you can still kind of implement what I'm talking about. But basically, you take the family situation at the time that they decide to split and put into place a basic framework. What does it cost to put a house, a roof over the kids, provide housing for the kids? Realistic cost, because what it was for one can't work for two. It's just not going to. In my area, if a family's living together and they're renting a 2-bedroom house or a 3-bedroom house, you're going to pay somewhere between $1,500 and $2,000 if you're lucky. Might be even higher than that. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, it's $1,700 for a 3-bedroom apartment. Now you got to do that twice. So that $1,700 is now $3,400. The law isn't really taking that into account. That needs to be accounted for. Here's what it is. Then you got to add in utilities. You got to add in food, all that stuff. The one-size-fits-all cookie-cutter approaches of the income models aren't going to work with that. My way of doing it would be that you come up with some way where the parents do it together, worksheets, that type of thing, and they work through it. I think doing it that way would reduce a lot of the animosity. The minute you get a lawyer involved on either side, you're effed, because the lawyer's out to make money. They're going to do everything they can to create issues and anger and all that stuff. We would propose that, look, let's streamline it to the sense that we're going to use the framework of what it was, and then realize we're now taking one and splitting it into two and adapting from there. And having a little bit more nuance when we're evaluating. One, what the child needs, right? And it should be down to basics. When I say basics, you need food, shelter, clothing. Johnny does not need $400 sneakers. Sorry, Johnny can get by on $60 sneakers or what. I just paid $60 for a pair of sneakers, all right? I don't get the high-end shit. I don't need it, all right? It's not about making sure, Johnny or Jane is bedazzled and all this stuff. Basics. That's what child support should be for. Because if the state has to support the child, welfare, if you will, that's all they're going to provide. Why is it different? Why is that theoretical standard of living thing still exist? And why does it only apply to one house or the other? That would be the first thing I would do. And then it's finding a way to find the balance moving forward also. So you get that established base and work from that. And then as things change, have some flexibility in that. If one parent or the other loses their job, take that into account, because that's what a married couple would have to do. Divorced, separated, whatever you want to call it, parents should be treated the same as married. What are the circumstances that a married couple would have to adapt to? That should be the same without running to a judge every time. This should be built in. Again, I could spend the next 5 hours, and I don't want to bore you with it, going through this. I have solutions, but I'm trying to give you the highlights and the little bits and pieces that we were talking about with them that still would apply now. Basically, it comes down to this: balancing the financial responsibilities of both parents while making sure the children are taken care of within the system. That's what it comes down to, and that's not being, done. There needs to be ongoing, continuous updates, research, reforms looked at, because society is changing rapidly right now. Um, Income levels are not rising, they're stagnant. Expenses have skyrocketed. None of that's taken into account. None of it. Right now, I'll use eggs as an example. A year and a half ago, because I just looked this up for another thing I'm doing, but I bought 5 dozen eggs from Wally World for $1.78. I have the receipt because I keep all my receipts. That was about a year and a half ago. 6 months ago, it was $15 for that same thing. Now it's around 7 or 8, right? None of that's factored in as far as like child support, right? Those expenses skyrocketed. Now they're coming down. Child support stayed here. Not realistic, right? And neither parent, by the way, had control over that. It's not mom's fault that eggs skyrocketed. It's not dad's fault. And I'm using eggs, but you can apply this across the board. Housing. Look at how rental rates, mortgage rates have skyrocketed, right? Where I live now, my house has almost doubled in value in the 6 years I've owned it. Nothing's changed. It's just literally doubled in value. That's okay for me because my mortgage stayed the same, but somebody who's buying a house now has to pay double the mortgage that I do. Things like that. In 6 years, there's been no changes to reflect that. Child support laws are pretty much the same now that they were 20 years ago, that they were 30 and 40 years ago. That's the whole purpose behind that. We need to have flexibility. Yes, I understand wanting it to be simple, but by being simple, you've made it extremely complex and extremely inflexible. And that's what needs to change. If you notice with all of this, as I come to a conclusion, I haven't talked about custody and, shared parenting and all that, because that's separate conversation. Yes, they're intertwined. Not totally respect that, but they're separate. When you're looking at things from a legal standpoint, a legislative standpoint specifically, you have to separate these things, right? They're never going to go for, guys will say to me all the time, when we were fighting for shared parenting bills, I hate the bill. It sucks. All the bill, because the bill was basically that the starting point for a judge was 50-50 and go from there and explain why you're varying from it. No big deal. Shouldn't have been. As opposed to the paradigm that we were seeing at that time and to this day, where mom got custody 90% of the time, primary custody 90% of the time. Start 50-50, go from there, as opposed to basically a 100-0 and go from there, right? The standard order of dad gets every other weekend and pizza night, as I call it. That's one issue. Child support is another issue. But guys, dads who would come at us when we tried to do that and things like this workshop, that workshop sucks. Why aren't you talking about custody too and all that? Because it's never going to fly legally. It's not going to happen. That mindset needs to change. All right. These are complex issues that need to be addressed. Could you do it all in one bill? Sure, you could. There is not enough room in my entire house to cover the paper that bill would be. You talk about what Congress writes, like the Fiscal Responsibility Act. It was thousands of pages. We don't want that. That's trying to get that through a state legislature it's going to bog down. We were trying to streamline things, right? Shared parenting was one bill. Child support reform was another bill. And this workshop was playing off of that. And there were other things, right? We wanted a bill to get rid of the word visitation, parenting time. Some success in some states with that. Visitation still, that alone, just trying to get that one change was complicated and complex because you're dealing with all different things, right? Politics is politics. So that's why when guys come at me and say, well, it's not good enough, I would say it is good enough. You got a huge elephant that's been created here, this huge bureaucracy. If we're going to make change, it's got to be small bites of that elephant, small changes along, but raising awareness on all these issues. So let me conclude with all this. My objective with this was to educate you, right? Make you understand why things are the way they are and why they're so freaking complicated and convoluted and all that stuff. That whole thing that I just went through was a workshop from 2005, 6, 7. It's now 2023. Nothing's changed. It's all basically the same. I mean, there has been some change, but it's all basically still the same. Because we need to focus on these individual things and raising awareness and speaking up. The bottom line is this: you can sit and bitch all day long. You can write all the crap you want on Facebook and Twitter and do all the YouTube videos, all that shit. But until you start taking action, and I'm not talking violence, don't be one of those freaking idiots. Oh, I'm going to stop it. I'm talking about legitimate action. I'm not even talking protests. Pick up the goddamn phone and call your legislator and say, I would like to come meet with you to talk about child support. Talk about some of the issues that I've brought up today. Talk about your story. It's the most powerful thing you can do. You know, go in and say, all right, I'll give you an example. We had a guy in our group who lost his job and went to jail for not being able to pay child support. That's why I harped on that earlier. He went in and talked to the legislators about his story and said, look, I wanted to pay. It wasn't that I didn't want to pay. I couldn't. I lost my job. The company up and moved. They just shut our doors and moved to another state. Did not hire any of us. Did not transfer any of us. There was no way I was keeping that job. And this was, 2008, 9. When, for those of you that were old enough back then, you know how bad the economy got. There was, no jobs, the housing market crashed and all that stuff. He's like, it's not that I don't want to pay. I just, he got a job making a fraction just so he had something coming in. And he did his best. But he wasn't even making enough. By the time they got done with federal and state taxes, which is why I harp on that all the time, and he had his rent, his car payment, and we're not talking, he was driving basically a beater car, and everything else. By the time he got done with all of that and his child support obligation, he was short something like $800 a month. Well, he can go get another job. Yeah, he could, but guess what? Then they're going to take that second job and apply child support to that also. So he would tell that story because one legislature said to him, well, go get a part-time job. And he looked at the legislature. He goes, the minute I do that, my ex is going to take me back to court, say that I have additional income from that, and try and get a higher thing. They're still going to impute the first job at what he was making, not what he is making. And the legislator just looked at him like, oh, crap, That's why we need to speak up. Go meet, tell your story. It's why I do what I do. It's why I talk about these things. The more you speak up, the more you educate them. It's not about being nasty. It's not about protests. It's education. That's how change is going to happen on all of this stuff. In this particular podcast, I'm talking about child support, okay? But in the realities of life, it's if you want change, family court reform, this is how you're going to go about doing it. It means doing what the women's groups do. Reach out to judges. You think they're not emailing judges? They are. They're doing it all the time. They'll send them news articles. Not the best idea, but it works for them. But meet with these people. I know people don't like when I say this. There are good divorce attorneys out there. Get them on your side. I've had some on this podcast. Get them to talk about the realities. Get this mindset that every dad's a deadbeat out. Get this mindset that the only reason dads want custody, more custody, is so they don't have to pay child support. You want to change that, you got to talk politely. It's not being an a-hole, all right? Politely. Reach out to the media. The media is not in our favor. But guess what? There are reporters out there that are going through a divorce. You catch one of them and they are willing to tell your story and they get it past their editor, boom. That's how change happens. It's what the women's groups do. All right? This is what we need to be doing. Until you're willing to take action, stand up and fight, nothing is going to change. All the crying and whining you're doing online is a waste of time, if I'm being honest with you. They don't care. They don't even see it. Tell you right now, no legislator is reading anything online. I see guys go on legislators' Facebook pages and write novels. You know who's reading that? Some college kid who's an intern in the office who, doesn't know the first thing about family law, doesn't have any kids. They're probably 18, 19 years old, don't know anything about this. It never gets to the legislator. They don't hear it. Your congressman, your state representatives, your local, they never see this stuff. Local might, but the rest of them don't. They pay interns to read this stuff. Go meet with them. Call their office. Hey, I want to come in and I want to meet with. Now, you may end up with an aide, and that's okay. My thing is the aides are more powerful than the actual legislators because the aides are the one that drives them. You get the right aide, you can get a lot done. All right. That's how you bring about change. All right. I am going to leave it at that. I was hoping for an hour and a half and I've hit that mark. I hope that you really watched this all the way through and that it helps you to get a better understanding. Again, you kind of notice I was neutral on things. I tried to be because that's what this workshop was. And I wanted it to come across that way. Child support reform needs to happen. It needs to happen now, not in the future. It can happen if we all stand up and raise our voices and speak out and share our stories. On that note, I hope you all have an awesome week. If you've watched this far, make sure you like it, share it because a lot of guys can get benefit from this. I speak primarily to guys. I don't mean to leave you ladies out, but my audience is 90% male, so that's why I use the term guys. It's not to slight you ladies in any way. Share it, like it, subscribe to the channel. I've got some other really good shows coming up. And hang in there because I know it's tough. I know it is. All right, till next time, this is Dan. Have an awesome day.